Lucas sat at his family's grand kitchen table, staring out the window at the sprawling estate that his family had built over generations. The estate was more than just a house, it was a legacy, something he had inherited without ever asking for it. He'd spent his whole life surrounded by luxury, from the gleaming marble floors to the vintage cars that filled the garage, each a symbol of his father Richard's success. Yet, despite all the wealth and status, there was always a nagging feeling in the pit of his stomach that he couldn't shake. Something about the life he had seemed too perfect, too easy. He shifted in his chair, glancing at his father, who was across the room, reviewing business papers with the same focused intensity he had displayed for as long as Lucas could remember. Richard was a man who had built everything from the ground up. He wasn't just rich, he was a force in the business world. People admired him, envied him, and, more than anything, respected him. Lucas had never been anything but proud of his father, but there was always this sense of distance between them. Richard had always been more of a mentor than a parent, more concerned with building an empire than with building a relationship. As a result, Lucas had never quite felt like he belonged in this world of wealth, no matter how many zeros were in his bank account. Despite the wealth, Lucas felt like a stranger in his own life. But it wasn't just the wealth that bothered him. There was something else that gnawed at him, his fiancée, Emily. They'd been together for over 2 years, and everything about their relationship seemed perfect on the surface. They were young, attractive, and successful in their own rights. Emily came from a respectable family, too, and their relationship had always seemed destined for a happy ending. They had everything they could ever want, except for one thing, trust. Lucas had always been haunted by a feeling that Emily might be with him for the wrong reasons. Was it love, or was it the money? Was she genuinely interested in him as a person, or was she enamored with the idea of being with someone who had everything? That question had eaten away at him for months, but he had never been able to find the courage to ask her. He had seen how her eyes lit up when they drove past the new luxury car they'd bought together, how she smiled when she slipped on a diamond ring at a gala, how she enjoyed the perks of their extravagant lifestyle. Lucas was no fool, he understood that money could change things. It could alter the way people saw you, the way they treated you, and, in some cases, the way they loved you. The thought of being loved for something as shallow as his wealth terrified him. He didn't want to be just another person in Emily's life who was worth only as much as his bank account. But he couldn't shake the doubt. It consumed him, especially when he thought about the future. What if they got married, and Emily's love was nothing more than a byproduct of his financial success? What if, one day, she'd leave him the moment the money ran dry? The doubts festered, and Lucas found himself growing more and more distant from Emily. He stopped sharing his thoughts and feelings, and their conversations became surface level. The more time they spent together, the more he wondered, was she really the one, or had he been blinded by the convenience of an ideal life? One afternoon, after a particularly uncomfortable dinner with Emily, Lucas found himself sitting alone in the study. The room was quiet, and the light of the setting sun cast a warm, orange glow over the polished wood. He leaned back in his chair, letting the silence envelope him. That's when his father walked in. "Son, something on your mind?" Richard asked, his voice calm but with an undertone of concern. Richard had always been perceptive, even when Lucas tried to hide his feelings. "I don't know, Dad. It's just, everything's been feeling off lately," Lucas admitted, running a hand through his hair. "I'm about to marry Emily, but I don't know if she's really in love with me. Or if she's just in love with the idea of being married to someone like me." Richard raised an eyebrow, setting the papers down on the desk and taking a seat across from his son. "Is that so?" "Yeah. I mean, think about it, Dad. She's always been so excited about all the material things we have. The house, the cars, the jewelry. Sometimes I wonder if she would still be with me if I didn't have all of this," Lucas said, his voice trailing off. The more he said it aloud, the more it sounded ridiculous to him. But the doubt was still there, lodged in his heart like a splinter he couldn't remove. Richard leaned back in his chair, thinking for a moment. "You know, Lucas, I think I have a solution for you." Lucas looked at his father, intrigued. "A solution? Why not test her?" Richard said casually, almost as if it was the most natural suggestion in the world. Lucas blinked in surprise. "Test her? How?" Richard's eyes twinkled with a hint of mischief. "We'll put her to the test. I'll dress up like a beggar, disguise myself completely, and see how she reacts when she doesn't know who I am. If she's truly in love with you, she'll treat me with kindness and compassion. If she's only interested in your wealth, then, well, I think we'll know where she stands." For a moment, Lucas stared at his father, unsure whether to laugh or be horrified. Was this really his father's idea of a solution? "You want me to have you dress up like a beggar and sit on the street to test Emily?" Lucas asked, incredulous. Richard nodded. "Exactly. She won't recognize me, of course. I'll wear the most ragged clothes I can find, and you'll watch from a distance to see how she responds. If she's truly interested in you for who you are, she won't just walk past me. She'll help. She'll show compassion." Lucas was silent for a moment, letting the absurdity of the idea sink in. On one hand, it seemed cruel, even manipulative. But on the other hand, it was a way to get the answers he had been too afraid to ask. It was a test that could either confirm his worst fears or give him the peace of mind he desperately needed. Finally, he spoke. "Okay, Dad. Let's do it." Richard smiled, a gleam in his eyes. "I'll take care of everything. You just make sure Emily is there at the right time." As they sat there, Lucas couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and dread. He didn't know if he was doing the right thing, but there was no turning back now. The plan was set in motion, and all he could do was wait to see what would happen next. The following days passed in a haze of preparation. Lucas couldn't shake the unease gnawing at him, but at the same time, there was a strange sense of anticipation building inside him. He felt as though this test would finally reveal the truth about Emily, and, perhaps, about himself as well. He couldn't stop thinking about the plan his father had proposed. Was it right to manipulate the situation this way? Was it fair to test someone he loved, someone he hoped would be his partner for life, like this? But every time he asked himself those questions, a familiar voice whispered in his head, "What if she's only with me for my money?" That was the fear, and it was the fear that made him agree to the plan in the first place. Over the next few days, Richard threw himself into the preparations. He made phone calls to old acquaintances who could supply him with the most worn-out, threadbare clothes imaginable. The clothes had to be just right, ragged, dirty, unrecognizable from the man he truly was. He meticulously planned every detail of the transformation. Lucas watched his father with a sense of awe mixed with discomfort as Richard, usually so immaculate in his appearance, spent hours perfecting his beggar persona. Lucas couldn't help but feel a sense of dread as he saw his father, the powerful businessman who had shaped his entire life, reduce himself to something that resembled nothing more than a shadow of the man he truly was. The day of the test finally arrived. Lucas could barely sleep the night before. He tossed and turned in bed, feeling the weight of what he was about to do. He had prepared himself for this moment, but as the hours crept closer, he began to question everything. What if Emily saw through it? What if she didn't react the way they expected? What if she was kind to the beggar, but not in the way they thought? The possibilities swirled in his mind, each one more confusing than the last. Finally, it was time. Lucas drove his car to the outskirts of town, to a spot he and Richard had picked out the day before. It was an area where the rich and poor lived side by side, a place where Emily would often pass by while on her way to a local cafe. It was perfect, a neutral location, yet one that felt familiar enough to make the encounter feel real. Richard had already left the house early that morning to make sure he was there first, and Lucas was supposed to arrive shortly after. When Lucas arrived, his heart was racing. He parked his car a few blocks away, trying to calm his nerves before stepping out. The city was bustling with the usual midday activity. Cars honked, people moved about in hurried strides, and the sound of distant chatter filled the air. As he walked toward the spot, he saw Richard sitting on a street corner near the cafe. The transformation was complete. Richard, who had always been so immaculate, was now unrecognizable. He wore a tattered coat, its sleeves frayed and torn at the edges. His once stylish shoes were covered in dirt, and his face was gaunt, his beard unkempt and wild. Richard's usual posture of authority was gone. He now slouched, his eyes vacant, his body hunched in a way that made him look much older than he really was. Lucas felt a pang of guilt as he stood there, watching his father. It was hard to reconcile the man in front of him with the one he had known all his life, the man who had taught him everything about business, who had raised him with a strict but fair hand. But now, sitting on the street like a stranger, he looked lost. His father was playing a role, but it was a role that made Lucas uncomfortable. This wasn't just a test, it was a manipulation, a way of turning Emily into a pawn in their family game. But there was no turning back now. Emily would be coming by any minute. Lucas's heart was pounding in his chest, and he felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. His father gave him a small nod from across the street, signaling that everything was in place. Lucas's mind raced as he waited. And then, just like that, she appeared. Emily came walking down the sidewalk, carrying a small purse and looking as beautiful as ever. She was dressed in a soft blue dress, her hair pulled back in a neat ponytail. As she approached, Lucas tried to remain calm, but his pulse quickened. He hid behind a nearby building, watching her every move. At first, Emily seemed unaware of the beggar sitting by the street corner. She was lost in her thoughts, her eyes scanning the sidewalk in front of her. It wasn't until she was almost directly in front of Richard that she finally noticed him. For a moment, she hesitated. Then, without breaking her stride, she dug into her bag, pulled out a few coins, and dropped them into Richard's outstretched hand. She gave him a brief, indifferent glance before continuing on her way, her footsteps light and unconcerned. Lucas felt a rush of disappointment. He had hoped, no, needed, to see her react differently. At the very least, he had hoped for some sign of empathy, some indication that she saw the beggar as a person and not just an obstacle to pass. But instead, she had done what most people would do, drop a few coins in his hand and walk away without a second thought. But then, just as Emily was about to round the corner, Richard spoke. "Please, a little kindness?" The words came out in a rough, ragged voice, and Emily stopped in her tracks, turning back to look at him. Lucas held his breath, watching the scene unfold from behind the building. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. Richard, playing the beggar, had said something that seemed to strike a chord with Emily. She paused for a moment, staring at him. For the first time, her face softened. She looked down at Richard's outstretched hand and, instead of simply walking away, she knelt down beside him. "Are you all right?" she asked gently, her voice tinged with concern. Richard, still in character, shrugged. "Just trying to survive." Emily nodded and, without hesitation, reached into her bag again. This time, she didn't pull out a few coins. She took out a crumpled dollar bill and handed it to him. But then she did something unexpected. She stayed there, looking at him for a moment longer. Her eyes were full of empathy, a tenderness Lucas had never seen from her. "You don't have to do this alone. I can help you." Richard didn't respond, but the change in Emily's demeanor was undeniable. She didn't offer him just money, she offered him her humanity. After a few more seconds of silence, Emily stood up and gave Richard a kind smile before turning and walking away. Lucas stood frozen, his heart in his throat. This wasn't the reaction he had expected, not by a long shot. For a moment, he felt a sense of guilt wash over him. He had put his fiancée to the test, forced her into an impossible situation, and yet she had passed with flying colors. She had shown compassion, not because of the money, but because she recognized the person behind the mask. As Emily disappeared from view, Lucas couldn't help but feel a profound shift inside him. This wasn't just about Emily anymore. It was about him. He had been so consumed with doubts, with fears of being loved for the wrong reasons, that he had overlooked the very things that mattered most: kindness, understanding, and genuine connection. As he watched his father, who had been so methodical in setting up the test, Lucas realized something important. This wasn't just a test of Emily's character, it was a test of his own. And the results were more complex than he could have ever imagined. The following days after the test were a blur. Lucas couldn't shake the images of what had happened. He had expected to feel vindicated in his doubts, but instead, he felt unsettled. Emily's kindness had completely thrown him off. It wasn't what he had anticipated, and it made him question everything about their relationship, his intentions, and his father's actions. He spent hours reflecting on that moment, the way Emily had looked at the beggar with such sincerity, the compassion in her voice. The more he thought about it, the more he felt like he had misjudged her, and maybe, just maybe, he had misjudged himself, too. Still, a small voice inside him questioned if she had acted out of pity or genuine kindness. After all, she could have walked away without a second thought, as so many others had. But she hadn't. She had paused, taken the time to kneel down beside him, and offered more than just a few coins. She had given him a piece of her heart, a gesture that seemed to transcend the wealth and status that defined their lives. Lucas had expected to see a woman who was just as shallow and materialistic as he feared, but instead, he had seen someone with a depth of character he hadn't realized she possessed. Was he wrong to doubt her? Was it possible that Emily truly loved him for who he was and not just for his family's wealth? The more he thought about it, the more confused he became. He wanted to believe that her actions spoke to her true feelings, but how could he be certain? He had been living in a world where appearances often mattered more than substance, where people were measured by their bank accounts and possessions, not their hearts. Could he really trust that the woman he was about to marry had seen past all of that? His father's actions had been a calculated test, but Lucas couldn't ignore the discomfort that had grown within him. Richard, for all his wisdom and experience in business, had played a dangerous game. The more Lucas thought about it, the more he realized how manipulative the whole idea had been. Had Richard simply been looking out for his son, or had he been trying to prove a point that didn't need to be made? Lucas didn't know anymore. He felt torn between wanting to trust his father and wondering if he had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The night after the test, Lucas found himself alone in the study, staring at the same desk where he had first shared his doubts with his father. He ran his fingers across the polished wood, deep in thought. The study had always been a place of authority, of business meetings and decisions that affected the future of the family. But tonight, it felt empty. The weight of the situation pressed down on him like a storm cloud, and he couldn't shake the feeling that everything was unraveling. His phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. He looked down and saw that it was a message. From Emily. Can we talk? I need to tell you something important. Lucas's heart skipped a beat. He stared at the message for a moment, unsure of what to do. His instincts told him to call her, to hear her voice, but he hesitated. Would she be angry with him for what he had done? Would she feel betrayed by the test he had set up for her? He had no idea how she would react. But there was one thing he was certain of: he couldn't put this off any longer. He needed to hear what she had to say. He took a deep breath and dialed her number. After a few rings, she picked up. Hey, Lucas, Emily's voice was soft but tense. Are you okay? Lucas swallowed hard, trying to steady himself. Yeah, I'm fine. are you? There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Lucas could almost hear the wheels turning in her mind. Finally, Emily spoke, her voice filled with uncertainty. I saw something today, Lucas, she began. I saw you watching me from a distance when I stopped to talk to the man on the street. At first, I didn't understand why you were there. But then, I realized what was going on. I know what your father had planned. Lucas felt his stomach drop. His worst fears had come true. She knew. She knew everything. Emily, he began, but she interrupted him. No, let me finish, she said, her voice steady now, though it carried an undercurrent of emotion. I need to tell you that I'm not angry, Lucas. I'm not even upset. I understand why you did it. I know you were testing me. But I want you to know that I don't need tests. I don't need to prove anything to you. I love you, Lucas. Not because of your family's wealth, not because of the house or the cars or the jewelry, but because of who you are. I saw that man on the street, and I helped him because I could see he was a person who needed kindness. I didn't help him because of your money or your name. I helped him because I want to make the world a better place, one small act at a time. And I want to do that with you. Lucas's mind was reeling. He had expected anger, accusations, maybe even a breakup. But instead, Emily had responded with nothing but understanding and compassion. She had seen through the facade, through the manipulation, and had chosen to react with the same kindness she had shown the beggar. For a moment, Lucas was speechless. His heart swelled with a mixture of gratitude, love, and guilt. How could he have doubted her? How could he have been so blinded by his own fears? I'm sorry, Emily, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I shouldn't have done that. I was so scared of being hurt, of being loved for the wrong reasons. I didn't trust you, and that was wrong. I don't know what came over me. But I need you to know that I love you. I love you for who you are, not for anything else. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and Lucas held his breath, waiting for her response. Finally, Emily spoke, her voice soft but full of sincerity. I know you do, Lucas. And I love you, too. But trust is everything. If we're going to move forward together, we need to trust each other fully. No more tests. No more games. Just us. Lucas's heart ached as he listened to her words. He had been so focused on proving something to himself, so caught up in his own insecurities, that he had nearly lost the person who meant the most to him. But now, as Emily spoke, he realized just how much he had to learn about love and trust. He nodded to himself, even though she couldn't see it. No more tests, I promise. Just us. In that moment, Lucas felt the weight of his actions lift. The clouds that had been hanging over him for days seemed to part, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of clarity. He had made a mistake, but it was a mistake that had led him to a deeper understanding of the woman he loved, and of himself. As he ended the call and sat back in his chair, Lucas felt a strange sense of relief wash over him. It wasn't about the wealth. It wasn't about the tests or the manipulations. It was about trust, about being seen for who he truly was, and being loved for that person. And in that moment, he realized that Emily had passed the most important test of all. The days following that conversation with Emily were filled with both a sense of resolution and a nagging undercurrent of reflection. Lucas knew that the path he had taken had irrevocably changed his view of his relationship with Emily. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had been living in a world of illusions, constructed by his own insecurities, and it was time to confront those illusions head-on. He realized now that true love wasn't about proving someone's worth. It was about accepting vulnerability and trusting that the person beside you was there for the right reasons, not because of the wealth, status, or the things that made life easy, but because of who you truly were underneath it all. But that didn't mean everything was simple now. Trust, like love, wasn't a one-time decision, it was a commitment that required constant work. Emily had been clear that she didn't need any more tests, but Lucas knew that her words had not only pointed out the manipulative nature of his actions but also revealed a larger, deeper truth about himself. He had to take responsibility for the damage he had caused, even if it was unintentional. The day after their conversation, Lucas reached out to his father. He had been avoiding Richard ever since the test, unsure of how to approach the situation. But there was no avoiding it any longer. The time had come to face his father's role in all of this. Lucas sat in his father's office, the same office that had always been a symbol of authority and control. The walls were lined with bookshelves, the desk was polished to a mirror shine, and Richard sat in his usual chair, exuding confidence and power. But this time, something was different. There was an air of uncertainty between them, a gap that had widened since the plan had been set into motion. Lucas cleared his throat and leaned forward, his palms resting on his father's desk. "Dad, I need to talk to you about the test," Lucas began. His voice was steady, but there was a weight behind it that he couldn't ignore. Richard looked up at him, his face unreadable. "I knew you were going to bring this up eventually," Richard said, his voice low and measured. "You're upset because you think I've manipulated the situation, right?" Lucas nodded, but he didn't feel angry. The anger had left him long ago. "It's not just about the test, Dad. It's about the way you've always operated, always playing the game, always trying to control the outcome. I didn't even see it until after everything with Emily. I realized how much I've been caught up in this idea that love is transactional, that it has to be about proving things." Richard leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers as he studied his son. "You're confused, Lucas. You always have been. This world doesn't work on feelings alone. It works on facts, on logic, on business. People act in their own self-interest. And love is no different. It's about understanding the people around you and making sure they're in it for the right reasons." Lucas shook his head. "But that's the problem, Dad. You think that everything is a negotiation, that every relationship is based on some exchange. But it's not. Love isn't a transaction. It's not something you can manipulate to get the answer you want. I realize now that I've been following the same path without even questioning it. But Emily, she showed me something different. I've been testing her because I've been afraid that she only loves me for the wrong reasons, and that's a reflection of my own fears, not hers." There was silence for a moment as Richard looked at his son, his expression unreadable. "You've always been a good kid, Lucas. But you're still too idealistic. The world isn't that simple. It never has been. Emily might have passed your little test, but that doesn't mean everything is perfect. What's going to happen when she's in the thick of the challenges life throws at you? Will she still love you when the money's gone, when the fame fades?" Lucas's heart clenched, but he didn't let it show. "I don't want to live my life only relying on money, Dad. I don't want to be stuck in this world where everything is about what you have, not who you are. Maybe that's why I've been so disconnected from Emily. Because deep down, I've always worried that I'm not enough, just me, the person I am. But what I've realized is that if Emily is the one for me, she will love me for who I am, not for what I can give her. I need to stop testing her, stop putting her through these scenarios to prove something that shouldn't need proving in the first place." Richard didn't say anything for a long time, and Lucas felt the weight of the silence between them. It wasn't easy to admit, but it felt right. There was no denying it anymore. He had to change his way of thinking, or he would lose everything that truly mattered. Finally, Richard spoke. "You're right. Maybe you are seeing things more clearly than I am. But don't get too carried away. Love isn't all you need, Lucas. People can be unpredictable. But if you truly believe Emily is worth it, then maybe you have something real. Just don't expect the world to make it easy." Lucas nodded slowly, taking his father's words in, though he didn't entirely agree with them. He understood his father's perspective, even if it was clouded by years of experience in the business world. But Lucas had made up his mind. He wanted more than just financial security and calculated success. He wanted a life filled with genuine connection, trust, and love. And that meant putting his heart on the line, just as Emily had done when she had shown him her kindness. The next few days were a whirlwind of emotions. Lucas spent more time with Emily, trying to rebuild the foundation of their relationship on honesty and trust. He took her out on long walks, had conversations about their dreams and their fears, and shared parts of himself he had never revealed to anyone. Emily, in turn, was open and vulnerable with him, allowing him to see sides of her that were deeper and more complex than he had ever imagined. They laughed together, they cried together, and slowly, piece by piece, they began to heal the fractures that had appeared between them. But despite the progress, there were moments of doubt. Lucas found himself questioning whether he could fully let go of the fears that had driven his actions. Could he truly trust that Emily was in this for the right reasons? Could he trust that love was enough to withstand the pressures of their world? And more than that, could he trust himself? One evening, a week after the test, Lucas sat on the balcony of their apartment, staring out at the city lights below. Emily was inside, preparing dinner. The night air was cool, and Lucas took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything that had happened. He closed his eyes for a moment and thought about what he had learned in the past few days. It wasn't just about Emily proving herself to him, it was about him proving something to himself. He had spent his whole life trying to control every situation, trying to protect himself from getting hurt, but he had learned that love couldn't be manipulated. It had to be earned through honesty, vulnerability, and trust. He realized that he didn't need to protect himself from the unknown. Instead, he needed to embrace the uncertainty and take the leap into the unknown with Emily by his side. When he opened his eyes, Emily was standing there, holding a glass of wine and smiling softly at him. She walked over and sat beside him, her presence a comforting warmth. "I'm glad we're doing this," Emily said, her voice filled with sincerity. Lucas turned to her, his heart full. "Me too. I don't know what the future holds, but I want to face it with you." Emily smiled, her eyes sparkling. "We'll figure it out together." In that moment, Lucas felt a sense of peace wash over him. He had made mistakes, but he had learned from them. The path ahead wasn't going to be easy, but he was ready for it. With Emily by his side, he knew that love, true love, was all they needed to face whatever came their way. Weeks had passed since that pivotal conversation with his father, and Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that he had entered a new chapter of his life, one where he was no longer bound by the constraints of wealth, status, or expectations. Yet, even as he found more clarity in his relationship with Emily, there was a lingering uncertainty about what was to come. The world outside their relationship seemed to demand answers, to insist that there was more at stake than just love. The pressure to conform to his father's expectations, to live up to the legacy of success, was never far behind. But as Lucas spent more time with Emily, he began to see her in a new light. She was not just the woman he had loved, but also his anchor in a world that often seemed to be spinning out of control. She reminded him of the simplicity of life, of what truly mattered. Emily's presence was like a soothing balm to his restless soul, offering him a sense of peace he had never thought possible. Her unwavering belief in him, despite the tests and the trials, made him feel seen in a way he hadn't experienced before. It was the kind of love that didn't require explanations or justifications, only trust and vulnerability. And for the first time, Lucas allowed himself to fully open his heart to her. But even as he embraced this newfound connection, he couldn't ignore the reality of the situation. The business world was still there, looming large, with its demands and expectations. Lucas's family had always been the cornerstone of his identity, and despite his desire to break free from the mold, he knew that the shadow of his father's empire would always be a part of him. Richard had been silent after their conversation, but Lucas could feel the weight of his father's gaze on him every time they spoke, every time they crossed paths. There was an unspoken understanding between them now, an understanding that Lucas had made his choice, and that his path forward would no longer be dictated by the expectations of others. But Richard's legacy was a heavy one to carry, and Lucas couldn't escape it. He had been groomed for greatness his entire life. The mansion. The business meetings. The endless stream of high-profile events. All of it had been mapped out for him from the moment he was born. Yet now, with Emily by his side, Lucas found himself questioning everything. Was it enough to simply follow in his father's footsteps? Could he create his own path, one that was free from the shackles of legacy and expectation? Or would he forever be defined by the choices that had been made for him long before he even had the chance to decide for himself? The weight of these questions hung over him like a dark cloud, and no matter how much he tried to ignore it, it was always there, lurking in the background. One evening, as Lucas sat at the dinner table with Emily, the conversation shifted to something more serious. They had just finished a meal, and the candlelight flickered softly between them. Emily looked at him with a mixture of concern and curiosity in her eyes. She had sensed his internal struggle, the tension that seemed to follow him wherever he went. Lucas could no longer hide it. The pressure had been building, and it was time to address it. "Emily," he began, his voice soft but firm. "I need to talk to you about something." Emily set her fork down and turned her full attention to him. She had always been a good listener, but tonight, there was something different in her demeanor. She could tell this was important, and whatever was weighing on Lucas's mind needed to be shared. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice gentle yet insistent. Lucas took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts before speaking. "I don't know if I can keep living like this. I feel like I'm constantly being pulled in two directions. I want to be with you. I want to build a life with you, away from all of this. But I can't ignore what's at stake. My father's business, his empire, it's everything he's worked for, and I've been groomed to take over. I'm supposed to be the one who carries the legacy forward. But the more I think about it, the more I realize I don't want it. I don't want to follow in his footsteps if it means sacrificing everything else." Emily reached across the table, her hand finding his. She squeezed it gently, offering her support without saying a word. Lucas could see the understanding in her eyes, but there was also a hint of sadness. She knew how much this meant to him. The empire that had been built from the ground up by Richard had cast a long shadow over Lucas's life, and the expectations surrounding him were suffocating. "But what about everything else?" Emily asked quietly. "What about the life you've always known?" Lucas looked at her, his expression conflicted. "I don't know if I can just walk away from it all, Emily. It's a part of me, whether I like it or not. And if I do walk away, there's no turning back. I've been set up for a life of wealth, power, and influence. How can I just throw all of that away?" Emily smiled softly. "You don't have to throw it away. You just have to decide what matters more. You don't have to choose between love and legacy, Lucas. You have the power to create your own future. Your legacy doesn't have to be defined by your father's business. It can be whatever you make of it." Lucas looked at her, his heart heavy with the weight of her words. Could he really do this? Could he truly let go of everything he had been taught to value and build something new with Emily? The future seemed uncertain, but one thing was clear, the life he had imagined for himself no longer felt like the right path. It was time to break free. But breaking free came with its own set of challenges. The more Lucas thought about it, the more he realized that there was no easy way out. Richard would never accept him walking away from the family business. It wasn't just about business, it was about control, about power, about keeping the legacy intact. And Lucas wasn't sure he was ready to take on the storm that would come with defying his father. There were other forces at play too. Lucas had inherited not just his father's wealth, but his network of influential connections. Those people would never understand why he would choose love over the business empire they had helped build. The pressure from all sides was overwhelming. But as the days went by, Lucas began to see more clearly. Emily was right. He didn't have to throw everything away, but he couldn't keep living a life that was dictated by expectations. He had the power to carve out a new path, a path that was built on his own terms. He couldn't live for anyone else but himself. And that meant making some hard decisions. One day, Lucas made up his mind. He was going to speak with his father one last time. He had made a decision that would change everything, and he wasn't going to let fear hold him back any longer. The conversation was inevitable, but Lucas wasn't going to approach it as the obedient son anymore. He was going to speak his truth. When he walked into his father's office that afternoon, Lucas knew that this would be the defining moment of his life. Richard looked up at him, his face unreadable, and Lucas could see the weight of the expectations in his eyes. "What is it, Lucas?" Richard asked, his tone cautious. "I've made my decision," Lucas said, his voice steady. "I'm not going to take over the business. I'm not going to follow in your footsteps." Richard's face tightened, his expression hardening. "What are you talking about? This isn't some game, son. You have responsibilities. This is your legacy. You can't just walk away from it." Lucas stood tall, no longer feeling the weight of his father's words. "I don't want to walk away from it, but I'm not going to live my life just to please you or anyone else. I want to live for myself, for the person I am and the life I want to build. I've chosen love, and that's the legacy I want to create. I'm with Emily, and we're building something together. It's not going to be easy, but I can't continue down this path if it means sacrificing who I am." The silence in the room was deafening. Richard stared at him, his face a mask of frustration and disbelief. "You don't understand, Lucas. You're throwing it all away for what? Some fleeting idea of happiness?" Lucas shook his head. "No, Dad. I'm not throwing anything away. I'm finally choosing my own path. This is what I want." The conversation was over. Richard didn't say another word, and Lucas knew there was no changing his father's mind. But for the first time, Lucas felt a sense of freedom. He had made his decision. And even though the road ahead would be difficult, he was ready to face it. With Emily by his side, they would build a new legacy, one founded on love, trust, and authenticity. Together, they would face whatever challenges life threw their way, knowing that they had each other to lean on. The days following Lucas's decision were a whirlwind of emotions, and as much as he tried to embrace the clarity of his choice, doubts lingered at the edges of his mind. He had made the choice to walk away from his father's legacy, to choose love and authenticity over the weight of expectation and power, but the ramifications were more profound than he had anticipated. With Emily by his side, the future suddenly seemed like a vast, untrodden path, one filled with both hope and uncertainty. The weight of his decision, however, hadn't fully hit until he began the process of unraveling the ties that had bound him to his family's empire for so long. For years, Lucas had been the heir to a vast fortune, a world of luxury and influence that seemed to promise security and success. His name was synonymous with power in the business world, and his every move was scrutinized by a network of investors, business partners, and even strangers who saw him as the future of an empire. But now, he had rejected all of that. And that's when the reality of his decision began to settle in. The first hurdle came when Lucas informed his father's most trusted associates about his choice to step away. He had always kept a tight circle of influential people around him, people who were not only business partners but also lifelong friends of the family. These individuals had seen Lucas grow from a young boy into a man who was poised to take over his father's empire, and they had invested not just financially but emotionally in the belief that Lucas would one day lead the business forward. To say that they were disappointed would be an understatement. The conversations with these individuals were tense, filled with disbelief and, in some cases, anger. They couldn't understand why Lucas would walk away from everything he had been groomed for, from everything that had been promised to him. "You're throwing your future away, Lucas," one of his father's closest associates, James, said during their meeting. "You have a responsibility, not just to your family, but to the people who have supported you your entire life. You can't just walk away from all of this. You don't even know what the real world looks like. It's not as simple as love and trust." Lucas took a deep breath, trying to maintain his composure despite the pressure mounting in the room. "James, I appreciate everything you've done for me. But this isn't about rejecting the people or the opportunities that have been given to me. It's about choosing a life that's truly mine. I can't keep living for someone else's expectations. This decision is not easy, but it's the one I need to make for my own well-being. I'm choosing a different path." The room fell silent. James's face, once filled with determination, now softened with an unspoken sadness. "I hope you know what you're doing," he said quietly. "But understand this, once you walk away, there's no turning back." Lucas nodded. He knew there was no turning back. But what he didn't expect was the feeling of isolation that came with that realization. It wasn't just the business world that seemed to recoil at his decision, it was the people he had known his whole life. His friends, those who had been by his side through thick and thin, suddenly seemed distant. They had always been there to celebrate the victories, to revel in the material rewards that came with his family's success. But now, as Lucas stepped away from that world, he found that many of these friendships were built on the very things he was walking away from. They didn't understand his choice. And for the first time in his life, Lucas felt alone, not just in the sense of physical isolation, but in a deeper, more existential way. The very things that had defined his existence were suddenly gone, and in their place was an unfamiliar void. Emily, however, remained steadfast by his side. She was the one constant in the whirlwind of change. While the world around them seemed to crumble and shift, Emily was unwavering. She supported his decision, even when others didn't, and offered him the emotional stability he needed to navigate the turbulence of his new reality. But even her support couldn't quiet the doubts that gnawed at him in the quiet moments. Was he making a mistake? Was he being reckless by abandoning the legacy his father had built? Emily could sense his inner turmoil, and though she never pressured him, she gently reminded him that this was his journey to take. "Lucas," she said one evening as they sat on the porch of their small apartment, "you've always been strong, even when you didn't realize it. The world may not understand your choice, but I do. I see the man you're becoming. And that man is someone who knows that love, trust, and authenticity are worth more than any legacy or empire." Her words were a balm to his weary soul, but still, the weight of his father's disappointment loomed large. Richard's reaction had been as expected, cold and distant. Their relationship, once filled with brief but meaningful conversations, had grown strained and awkward. Lucas's decision had been a betrayal in his father's eyes, and there was no pretending otherwise. For Richard, the family business was everything, his life's work, his identity, and his legacy. He couldn't comprehend why Lucas would choose something as intangible as love over the concrete security of the business. The last time they spoke, Richard had barely looked Lucas in the eye. "You'll regret this," he had said, his voice tight with frustration. "You think you're making the right decision now, but life isn't a fairy tale. One day, you'll see that you can't live without the power, without the influence. The world doesn't care about your dreams, Lucas. It only cares about what you can offer it." The words stung, but Lucas had learned long ago that his father's words were often rooted in fear and control. Richard didn't understand him, didn't understand the yearning that had grown in Lucas's heart to find something more. But Lucas no longer sought his father's approval. He had walked away from that world, and now he had to learn how to live in this new reality. As the weeks turned into months, Lucas and Emily built a life together, one that was simple but filled with meaning. They moved out of the city and found a small house in the countryside, far removed from the world that had once defined their every move. It wasn't a life of luxury, but it was a life of freedom, a life that was theirs to shape. Lucas found work in a small local business, not for the money, but because it gave him the opportunity to contribute to something tangible, something real. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest. He spent his days working alongside people who didn't know his name, who didn't care about his wealth or his family's reputation. They simply saw him for who he was, a man trying to make an honest living. Emily, too, found fulfillment in a job that allowed her to connect with others. She started a small non-profit to support local youth, offering mentorship and guidance to those who needed it most. She had always had a passion for helping others, and now she was able to live out that passion on a daily basis. Together, they built something beautiful, something that was based on love, trust, and the shared belief that there was more to life than the material things that so often dominated their world. Yet, even as they forged this new path, the shadows of their pasts lingered. Richard had stopped calling, stopped reaching out. The weight of their estrangement grew heavier with each passing day. Lucas had tried to reach out to his father, but each attempt was met with silence. His father had made it clear that he disapproved, that Lucas had chosen the wrong path. But despite the distance that had grown between them, Lucas couldn't deny the small part of him that longed for his father's acceptance. He missed the connection they once had, the moments when they could talk about things that mattered beyond business. But he knew that, for now, that relationship was beyond repair. As he and Emily sat on their porch one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink, Lucas felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. His life was far from perfect, but it was his own. And for the first time, he felt as though he was truly living. The future was still uncertain, but with Emily by his side, Lucas knew he could face whatever came their way. The choices he had made had led him to this moment, and in this moment, he knew that he had made the right decision. He had found his own path, his own truth, and that was worth more than any legacy, any empire, any inheritance. It was a new beginning, and together, they were ready to embrace whatever came next.